I read Founding Brothers, The Revolutionary Generation by Joseph J. Ellis, published in 2000 and winner of the Pulitzer Prize. It was unlikely that the Constitution would succeed. Republics had existed before, but none as geographically large as the 13 colonies, and none had survived for very long. The colonies had little history of cooperation, and the values written in the Declaration of Independence repudiated strong central government. Yet it succeeded. The Duel. On July 11, 1804, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr rode across the Hudson River to Weehawken, New Jersey. They carried erratic pistols. The most likely outcome was that nobody would get hurt. Apparently Hamilton fired first and intentionally missed, and a few seconds later, Burr fired to kill, and the ball struck Hamilton's side and ribbed. Hamilton died the following afternoon. Burr was denounced by the press and fled all the way to Georgia. Through letters, Burr had demanded Hamilton apologize for calling him despicable, and when he evaded it, Burr challenged Hamilton to the duel, which he felt by honor he had to accept. They had been on opposite political sides for 3 decades, and Hamilton had regarded Burr as an opportunist in a fragile republic. The dinner. Thomas Jefferson was summoned to dinner by George Washington, and there he met Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. They agreed to this deal, that state debts would be assumed by the federal government, and in exchange the capital would be located along the Potomac River. Hamilton wanted power to be controlled by urban elites like himself, yet agrarian Jeffersonians were suspicious. The Constitution provided Congress to select a seat of government, but each region wanted to host the capital. The revised Assumption Bill set Virginia's debts and taxes both at $5.3 million, and proposed that the capital should be chosen by the executive. Washington chose a place in the wilderness along the Potomac River where he already owned land. The Silence. In 1790, Quakers in Congress wanted to end slavery. This was perceived as a threat to the Union, and most of Congress did not want to discuss it at all. Slavery was contrary to the values of the Declaration of Independence, and many northern states had already abolished it, but the South could not perform economically without it. Virginia had the greatest number of slaves, but seemed open to ending the slave trade. Some believed whites and blacks could not live together. The rising slave population made advocates worry that they were running out of time. Some advocates recommended gradual emancipation and compensation for slave owners. They also considered sending blacks to some overseas homeland. Benjamin Franklin was well respected and spoke in favor of abolition. James Madison tended to make unclear statements about it, but guided legislation to clarify that the federal government could not interfere in slavery until after 1808. This appeared to settle the issue. The Farewell. George Washington was a legend. In 1796, his farewell address was printed. Washington was about 6'4", but he had declined with age. He had a few critics, but taking on Washington was political suicide. He had willingly given up power as commander of the Continental Army. Washington originally asked Madison to write his farewell address, but then Madison joined the opposition, so Hamilton did it instead. Hamilton successfully captured what Washington wanted to say. He left office in 1797 and died in 1799. The Collaborators. Adams was a stout New Englander and Jefferson an elusive Virginian, but they had been a team since the Declaration of Independence. Adams, as vice president, had been forbidden to speak in Congress. James Madison quietly orchestrated Jefferson's presidential campaign to succeed Washington, as Jefferson himself remained unaware. In the election, New England preferred Adams, the South preferred Jefferson, so Adams won 71-68. Adams was willing to bring Jefferson into his cabinet, but Jefferson figured the next administration would be burdened by Washington's poor choices, so he turned the offer down and made himself the leader of the Republican opposition. Both parties regarded the other as treasonable. In the 1800 election, New York went to Jefferson, and Jefferson won 73-65. The Federalist Party was over. By Inauguration Day, Adams had already left for home, and the pair did not speak again for 12 more years. The Friendship. In 1804, Abigail Adams wrote to Jefferson after his daughter died during childbirth. Jefferson responded by saying that he would forgive Adams for the midnight judges, but it was Jefferson who needed to be forgiven for his behind-the-scenes duplicity. Things were silent for another 8 years. Adams was envious that Jefferson was becoming the hero of the Revolutionary Era narrative. Adams wrote to Benjamin Rush to encourage the two men to reconcile. Both men were writing not just to each other, but to posterity. Jefferson wrote lyrically, and Adams wrote excitedly. They disagreed over whether the few or the many should rule. Adams observed that as long as property exists, there will always be an aristocracy of some sort. The statesmen who shepherded the Revolution were themselves an aristocracy. Their later letters reflect on aging and death. On July 4, 1826, 50 years after the Declaration. Both Jefferson and Adams died. I watched the movie 1776. This is a movie musical produced in 1972. The film opens on John Adams, who is pushing the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia to declare independence from Great Britain, but he is obnoxious and disliked and having very little success. He sometimes duets with his wife Abigail. We are introduced to Benjamin Franklin. His actor Howard De Silva plays him as a quirky old man, and he is the best part of the film. We are introduced to all the delegates from the 13 colonies, sitting at tables, though I had a hard time remembering all their names. The Congress's president is John Hancock. A sign on the wall helpfully indicates what day it is. The costumes consist of waistcoats, hair ties, and frilly neck scarves. I don't know if these are historically accurate or not, but it looks a little silly to see everybody dressed like this. But it's a silly musical, so that's fine. The Congress sometimes receives dispatches from General George Washington, whose army is losing most of the battles. Richard Henry Lee returns from Virginia with a resolution for Congress to vote on independence. However, all the colonies must unanimously agree for independence to be declared. John Adams chooses Thomas Jefferson to write a list of grievances, which becomes the Declaration of Independence. It is read aloud, and the delegates make many amendments to it. The southern states don't like the mentions of slavery and walk out, so Adams agrees to remove that section. The film ends with all the colonies agreeing to declare independence and writing their names down as the Liberty Bell rings. I think it's a fun musical. I'd give it a 9 out of 10.